did it get to 937? Go on. I talk too much. Materialized views. Question that came in. We have a data warehouse, obvious choice from materialized views, and a number of the materialized views were taking too long to refresh, so we dropped them. I like this approach. I like the idea of that's running slow. Let's get rid of it. The fastest way you can run something is not to run it at all. And yet our refresh procedure still runs for a long time. What's going on? And that bamboozled me because a little bit of back and forth with this customer, and they said, yeah, we've dropped all of them. Yeah, all the materialized views in our data warehouse schema are gone, and yet the refresh procedure we're running is taking a long time. And that had me scratching my head. And ultimately, this turned into an example of understanding the built-ins available to you. This is a simple misinterpretation. So the fact that one customer had this misinterpretation, I thought it was important that we should share it with the community so no one else gets hit by this as well. I've got one materialized view in my schema at the moment called MV, and it was last refreshed at 21:38:38. As you can probably tell, I just created it there. I'm going to refresh it now. So, I'm going to refresh all my M views and just chug away. And this is the procedure the customer was using. It's nice and simple, just one call to an API. Takes a little while because that materialized view might be obviously a bit complicated, and it's done. And this is the same customer issue we have here. That took way longer than I would have liked. I don't like that. And if I go look at the last time all my materialized views have been refreshed, we start to get an inkling of what's going on. I did refresh all M views. Here's my M view on my own schema here, which refreshed at 28:38:56 just a few seconds ago. But I've got a materialized view in the Ask Tom schema. I've got a couple of them. I've got a materialized view in the SamGam schema from one of my talks last year. And notice they were all refreshed as well. And that's a key thing to remember. DBMS MView refresh all M views is database wide. In fact, easy way to prove that. Let me drop my materialized view. So there's no materialized view in my schema anymore, and I run it, and guess what? It's going to run for 15 seconds again, or however long it took last time, even though there are no materialized views in my own schema. And this is where the customer was getting simply caught out. They were using this documented view, and nothing while it was going on, they had materialized views for other applications in other schemas. The easiest way of seeing that this is an issue is if I connect to a much lower privileged user. I was logged on as a DBA before, like Scott Tiger. I try run refresh all M views. I get insufficient privileges because Scott doesn't have the privileges to refresh materialized views in other schemas, obviously, and that's the default thing. So be aware of that. Refresh all M views is one of those rare utilities that doesn't look just in your own schema. Almost everything we do in terms of APIs normally sits just in our own schema. Refresh all M views doesn't. It's looking database wide. So what should we be using? Well, let's explore a bit further. I've reconnected as a DBA user. That's my local user here. Here are my other schema materialized views. They've all been refreshed at 21:40, except for this SamGam one. How about if I run this, DBMS MView refresh all? Now that came back instantaneously. So presumably, if we have a look, it hasn't refreshed any of the schemas that took at least 15 seconds. Let's create a new materialized view now in my own schema. So I've called this materialized view in my schema. So now I've got one in my own schema. So maybe that's what refresh all touches. It's also instantaneous, but maybe it still refreshed it, but it didn't. We can see here that the refresh time hasn't been changed. So what does refresh all do? If it doesn't refresh things not in your schema, and it doesn't refresh things in your schema, what does refresh all do? It does nothing. Well, it does something. It's not in the documentation. It used to be, but you won't find refresh all in the documentation anymore. Refresh all is actually a hangover of the legacy of materialized views. Who remembers when materialized views were called snapshots? And back in the day, back in the Oracle 7 days, you would create these things called snapshots as part of advanced replication. And as part of the actual DDL, you would say, I'm going to create my snapshot. You would actually put the refresh interval inside the DDL definition. I want to actually refresh it every 7 days, for example. what would happen is the database would create something in DBMS job for you to actually take care of that. DBMS MView refresh all would actually run all the jobs that were defined to refresh snapshots. So we don't do that anymore. So refresh all does nothing unless you have these older style DDL commands that have actually created jobs to run snapshot refreshes for you. So refresh all you shouldn't be using, and which is why we took it out of the documentation. This is generally probably what you want to do. It's a little bit of code. It's sad that we don't have a schema level API, and I'll put an enhancement request, but we know what's going to happen there. Just write yourself a little loop, select username for your own MViews, and then just DBMS MView refresh. That is the equivalent of a schema level refresh all my MViews. And you can see now that in my schema has now been freshly updated. So just a little bit of a sort of misnomer there and misinterpretation of how these things work. I will dwell just a touch on materialized views. Is the fact that this customer was happy to drop materialized views, I think is actually a good thing in general. Materialized views, I often find, don't get me wrong, they have their place, but are often a legacy of how we used to approach, especially data warehouses, in the concept of load the raw data and then spend a lot of time building lots and lots of different summary informations and storing them as well. But a lot of that stuff, especially if your database data warehouse is read-only, and that's the most common example, read-only for a period of time, that's why we create these materialized views, is look at things like result caching. Result caching is like a just-in-time materialized view. In that way, you can actually cache the results as opposed to caching the summary data. So rather than running a materialized view, run the same query, but use a result cache. And therefore, people get the benefits, even faster results, and you're getting effectively the same kind of benefits. We have all these technologies now to make querying large amounts of data in an ad hoc fashion very, very efficient. We have full database cache, large table caching, automatic large big table caching in warehousing, and of course in memory. Even if you're not licensed for in-memory, doing something like using the free 16 gigabytes worth of in-memory, for example, just the most recent partitions in your data warehouse, is often all that's needed and gives so much more flexibility than telling your customers, oh yes, that's the summary table we've created for a materialized view, that's the query you have to run, that's it. Always look for examples where you might be able to do away with materialized views simply as a reflection of how modern the hardware has become and how modern the technical features have become when it comes to data warehousing and analytics.